Recent Education Review Office reports have found that although many schools are failing to meet the needs of tamariki with disabilities, those schools with greater numbers of Māori and Pacific students were more inclusive and performed better at valuing diversity. Earlier, we spoke with Professor Missy Morton from the University of Auckland about whether Māori leadership better lends itself to the demands and needs of disabled learners.
Well, can I first expand just a little bit on some of the findings about Māori students in particular? You're right, schools with a high Māori student role have a much stronger culture of inclusion of disabled learners and their whānau, and they're much better at engaging with whānau. And in those schools, those learners really enjoy school and enjoy learning. But it's important to also note that a significant number of Māori disabled learners are still experiencing exclusion and poor outcomes. So, for example, about a fifth of families reported being discouraged from enrolling their child at their local school, and 24% reported being asked to take their child home.
Okay.
And that's similar for Māori and for non-Māori. But let's come back to that very significant finding about which schools are the more inclusive schools. The Education Review Office found that among Māori disabled learners who responded to their survey, 40% of those students were attending a school with a very high Māori role. And those schools tend to have a much stronger culture of inclusion for disabled learners compared to schools with a low Māori role. And in those schools, whānau were much more likely to be satisfied or very satisfied with how the school supported inclusion. And schools with a high Māori role similarly reported much better engagement with family, hapu and iwi, and they worked together to support the learning and belonging of disabled learners.
Yeah, so the report also found that families of many disabled learners are being actively discouraged from enrolling their children at early childhood services in schools, which obviously is incredibly sad, but too surprising? I'm not sure, because the challenges must be overwhelming. So how do we ensure our system is delivering equity for these learners?
I'd say it's more than sad, Neil. It's against the law.
Okay.
And it often takes the form of subtle or not very subtle encouragement to go somewhere else. You know, there's a much better school down the road, or our service doesn't have the right equipment. And those things could be true for now, but it's about getting all schools and early childhood services to have all the things they need in place to welcome all kids and their families. And so some things that can make a difference right now are having early childhood services in schools, including boards of trustees, being better informed about their obligations and responsibilities, having parents and whānau have better understanding of what their rights are when enrolling children. But sometimes that's a bit tricky, because you don't want to rock the boat when you already feel like your access is precarious, about whether even getting in there depends on someone's goodwill rather than being welcomed from the get-go. But I think the key elements are people understanding what their responsibilities are, and also having much better and clear pathways to the supports that are available, whether it's supports in terms of additional services input, or it's supports in terms of teacher education and teacher development.
Now, we also see that inclusion in some schools is a whole other education piece, and obviously needs to include principals and boards buy-in, to your point. But how do you believe schools can foster a culture of inclusion? Is it about more funding for children with high needs, or insistence that schools play their part?
I think it's the latter. It's insistence that schools play their part. It's the schools that are enrolling students now and doing a really good job around inclusion. They're not well-off schools. They're very resourceful schools, but they're also really committed and welcoming everybody in their community being part of their school. So there's a heart and mind shift, as well as increasing access to supports, I suppose, and teacher education.
Look, we could talk more on this topic. It's a fascinating topic, fascinating report. Professor Missy Morton from the University of Auckland, Waipapa Taumatarau. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing the report findings. Ngā mihi.
Ngā mihi.